And I just look at the world today and I'm like, holy cow, this is the most important, neglected, and tractable thing I could possibly be working on. The idea of showing thousands, hopefully millions of folks, it turns out that you can have an MDMA-like experience simply within yourself. Like it's just waiting for you to open up the trap door. And the subsequent like mental health benefits that come from knowing you're capable of doing that, like it's something you can't unsee. And I think it's profoundly valuable. In many ways, just the start. It's not in place of all these other great traditions. It just 10x's what all these other traditions have, because you can do it faster and easier and you're motivated to do so.
Stephen Zerfas is the co-founder of Jhourney, a company that aspires to make life-changing altered states traditionally only available to advanced meditators accessible to anyone. 5 years ago, Stephen found himself crying tears of joy after he had stumbled into a profound state of ecstatic bliss. He eventually learned that these states are available to all humans and that you don't actually need to be a longtime meditator to begin to experience them on demand. In this conversation, we discuss the nature of these states called jhanas and how making them accessible with the potential help of technology may just change the world. Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Hey, Stephen, what's going on, man?
Hey, Scott. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you on the show and excited to dive into the world of Jhanas and your story. I know that I first read about them through Daniel Ingram's book. I believe it's called
Mastering Core Teachings of the Buddha.
The Core Teachings of the Buddha. That's it. He's been on the podcast. Awesome dude. But then I kind of really just stopped there. You know, I never really went into depth on the jhanas specifically. So maybe as a frame for the conversation, what are the jhanas and why should we care about them?
Yeah. So there's layers to that conversation layers to that question, because the term jhanas means different things in different contexts. So I'll start with how we think about them, and then I'll give just a little bit of the historical political context. So we think of jhanas as a subset of altered states that you can learn to enter into in meditation that are profoundly valuable for mental health. They span the spectrum from bliss to peace. And when you're in a jhana, it's not like you're confused about if you're in a jhana. You're like, holy cow, what just happened to me? Did I take a drug? And this ability to enter into profound states of bliss or peace and kind of there in between without a drug is something that is great fun and valuable during the meditation sit while you're in there, but also has cascading mental health benefits. So one of my favorite quotes is like, why would I have a second piece of chocolate cake when I know it can beat that by 100x in 10 minutes with my eyes closed? We know people for whom it's been a key part of them coming out of addictions to heroin and opioids. There's a mentality of abundance in the same way that like if you're no longer dying of starvation or thirst, it's easier to be the person you aspire to be. It's easier to be pro-social. It's easier to live into delayed gratification. So too, if you know that you can move yourself to a profoundly bliss or peaceful state in a few minutes notice, in some ways you don't grapple from the same sense of scarcity around maybe like mood poverty, for lack of a better phrase. So this is why we're so excited about these states. The jhanas in particular, it's a Pali word, and they're practiced in pockets of Buddhism, specifically kind of Theravadan, and then inside the Theravadan or early Buddhism, there's different interpretations about whether or not they've been inspired by later sacred texts or earlier sacred texts, and this has implications for what constitutes and what defines a jhana. And happy to get into that and sort of the historical political definition But the bottom line for us is that a subset of folks appear to have learned to enter into states that they sometimes talk about being like MDMA without the drug, and they can do so on command without external stimuli, and the mental health implications are really exciting.
I mean, anybody that's tried MDMA, who wouldn't want that? That sounds amazing. And like, how did you discover this for yourself?
Yeah. So the personal story here is about 5 years ago. I was going through a really difficult mental health period. It was just a perfect storm. I was breaking up with a co-founder and a girlfriend at the same time. I went from 2 jobs to no jobs in a day. There was some challenging family dynamics at play. And I ended up going on a Goenka style Vipassana 10-day meditation retreat, intense, like meditate 10 plus hours a day, get up at 4 a.m. sort of thing, as a bit of a Hail Mary to just see if I could find some tools to help me navigate a tough time. And I promptly had 3 migraines in 8 days. It was just absolutely in the gutter. And unbeknownst to me at the time, I had just mountains on mountains of self-critical thought patterns. We're so frequently blind to the moment-to-moment experience that's in each side of our own heads. And I think there are certain patterns that we adopt, whether we know it or not, that lead to very different levels in baseline well-being. And I've been chasing some high-flying, kind of high-pressure jobs and leading a lifestyle for a period of time that had led to lots of self-criticism. On the very last day, I changed the technique and ended up in sort of this explosively altered state where I was streaming tears of joy for 60 minutes, wide open, spacious gratitude, most blissful thing that had happened to me in over a year and a half, easy. And afterwards, I was like, what the heck was that? Can I recreate that? If so, that changes everything. And so I set out mostly on my own. I thought I wasn't super big fan of the Goenka specific style and lectures. I also grew up Catholic and was worried that if I delved into the world of meditation, there'd be rich stuff there, but it would be slow to find, like reading theology. And so I set out to just do personal experiments. And over the next 4 to 10 months, gradually taught myself to recreate this state. It was slow. It's slow in the beginning. We can talk about kind of the ramp up and that process if you're interested, but eventually got to the point where I was crying tears of joy to 5 to 10 minutes notice every day before work for like 30, 40 minutes. Life had done a 180. Mental health had gone from like all-time low to all-time high and growing. Easy to stay relaxed and focused at work. Neuroticism and negative affect plummeted. Didn't know it was the Jhanas. Had just sort of like stumbled myself into this sort of like extraordinary states. Wanted to share it with friends and family. Nothing more I wanted to share. And it was a complete non-starter. They were like, Stephen, you're crying tears of joy for 30 minutes before work? Like, you need to see somebody about that. Or alternatively, like, that sounds great, dude, but I don't have 10 months and like all these hours to run self-experiments to find out whether or not you're a freak. So it more or less stayed my secret for a couple of years until I discovered the first book was actually Lee Brazenton's Right Concentration, and got goosebumps reading it, being like, this is exactly what happens to me every morning. And then that actually ends up becoming a professionally significant moment because I realized, well, the single thing I care most about is not only, one, I'm not alone, and 2, it's tractable because thousands of other people have been practicing these. So that's how a lot of these started.
A very inspiring and enchanting tale. And what comes up for me is, do you believe that what allowed you to tap into this state was a specific technique, or was it more kind of a fundamental depth of consciousness that for some reason you just happen to have?
I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. I guess in some ways I want to say both. A very, very common report of folks who learn these states is that it doesn't feel as if you're like, they feel familiar. It's like, oh, like this, this thing that I had this, when I enter into this flow state and I have this special memory of this time in childhood, when I like, it turns out I can go back there. And often actually going back there is a process of subtraction and removal, as opposed to sort of like do this new like crazy mental flip in your head. And so in in some ways, I feel like this spectrum of bliss to peace is kind of like the underlying consciousness that's in the background and everything. And all that we're doing when we learn the jhanas is getting yourself into a place in which we're kind of A, collected, and B, having peeled back some of the stuff that clouds us and separates us from that in the first place.
Yeah, it's. I'm glad you kind of clarified how you think about it, because I agree with you. I do think our fundamental natural state of being is ecstatic bliss, ecstatic joy, ecstatic love. But, like an old temple that's been covered with soot, it's buried. So it's not there. And in my own experience, it's been a very long unlayering process to kind of access those more natural, deeper parts of self, which is a little bit different than, oh, if I just kind of do this concentration in this way, I can kind of crack into this part of my being. You know what I mean? It's one is kind of more of a prolonged, sustained transformation process, and the other is like, no, you're just kind of not opening the door in the correct way.
Yeah. So you there's a let me give a little bit of additional context as to how the word jhana is used in a couple different traditions, because I think what you just highlighted is arguably a distinction that a couple different, particularly one tradition says, like, no, don't do the jhanas, do that way, do the jhanas this way. So the word jhana is this really overloaded term that refers to different states depending on what tradition you're coming from. It actually also predates Buddhism. So the word dhyana in Hinduism, arguably the Buddha's original IP, so to speak, was to discover that the jhanas were these great tools in of themselves, but didn't take you all the way. And so traditionally, in basically all Buddhist traditions, the jhanas are used as a warm-up practice for engaging in more personality changing or like capital I insight work, like contemplating the nature of reality kind of stuff. There's a little bit of this interesting historical political accident that contributes to the different schools of thought. So if it takes me about a minute or two to explain, maybe I'll just do that real quick. The way I understand the unfolding of the different approaches to jhana is that originally the Buddha in the suttas and some of the earliest sacred texts in Buddhism talks about jhana all the time. Just jhana this, jhana that, telling everybody to use the jhanas. They're clearly something that everybody has access to. Several centuries go by, and the Visuddhimagga is written, and in this text, it's very different. The jhanas are like legendary. There's something like 1 in a million monks will enter in their lifetime. And during this period, it seems as if there has been an institutionalization of religion. The monasteries and monks have set up. The jhanas gradually over time become something that is really only accessible to folks who dedicate their lives to this practice. Another number of centuries go by, and there's a bit of like a democratization or take back religion for the people moments in which a number of dry insight practices emerge. And these include some of the noting practices like Mahasi Sayadaw style noting, and arguably also some of the Vipassana traditions that don't use altered states, perhaps Goenka is in this category. And in this moment, it's like, no, you don't need to do these legendary concentration practices in order to get enlightened. You can go straight there. Everybody can do this. And then fast forward until relatively recently, starting maybe in I forget when Aya Kama sort of had her moment. It was either in around the 60s or so. And a few other teachers have cropped up in the last several decades. And they've said, no, actually, there's a way in which you can practice these altered states, these jhanas, that don't involve going without a thought for 3 hours. That's accessible to everybody. And when you do so, you see some really fantastic changes in your own psyche that allow you to then do things like personality changing meditation, really better understand the nature of consciousness and so on. This school of thought in particular, this third school of thought, is the one that we've really drawn a lot of our inspiration from, because they're talking about a replicable altered state that's accessible to everybody. And critically, they really emphasize don't get super concentrated and brittle and then have this explosive peak experience or something. In many ways, you particularly the aware folks, the tranquil wisdom insight meditation folks say, welcome everything in. like really sink back into all of your experience and hold like loving kindness at the center of this. And when welcoming and loving all of the distractions and returning to loving kindness, gradually you'll just get a new level of collectedness. And from this, you'll kind of find like your sort of inner nature begin to move into the joy and peace spectrum.
So what I take from that is that this is something that anybody can do, regardless whether you've been meditating for a decade or maybe you're relatively new. And it seems to be there's some, some dedicated practice that when people do that with enough proficiency, this becomes accessible to them.
That's right. And that's why we're so excited about it. It used to be that it was thought that you needed thousands of hours or something to practice this. I think it's become clear, thanks to a number of teachers that have been practicing in this sort of new school of thought, that there's at least a version of these states that are accessible and something much less, something on the order of like dozens or sort of, I think for a while there it was maybe around the 100-hour mark. Recently, in like 2018, we've seen a number of teachers get it down to something like 25 to 40 hours with about 60% success with novices. That's what we're starting to see on our retreats. We've now run 3 retreats, all with about 70% success in teaching novices to enter into these states. This is without tech. We're laying on tech in the weeks and months to come. All in something like, this is a week-long retreat. So this is not something that's legendary and impossible to learn. It is, in fact, something that's doable in what amounts to a few days.
Wow. Sounds transformative. Why is this not more of a thing?
So the biggest thing is that, this is so what I just gave you is this kind of like the arc of this of the movement through the different schools and the thought on the jhanas was this like problem that drove me crazy for like 2 years after I discovered what they are, because I was like, how the heck is this not like explosively popular? And that's the answer, is that it went from something that was explosively popular to then becoming institutionalized, then becoming, there's a period of backlash, and then only just more recently has it kind of come full circle. The original sort of like Western mindfulness leaders, people like Jack Kornfield, Shan Salzberg, John Kabat-Zinn, all come from traditions that are more in this like either dry insight or perhaps more like Visuddhimagga inspired camps. And so the first...
Can you define dry insights?
Yeah. So dry insight versus wet insight, colloquially, refer to two different paths to enlightenment. Insight being that which kind of like leads to enlightenment. Dry insight is you just go straight there. You just do noting practices, or you do like self-inquiry, like who am I practices. And also in this camp, you can get the sudden approaches as opposed to the gradual approaches. Like non-dual traditions typically are like, you just need to see your true nature and then boom, you wake up instantly. The wet insight is specifically the use of altered states to prime yourself and get yourself into a spot where then you engage in some of these other practices. And that will make it much more likely that you have a profound experience. It's like sharpening your saw before cutting down the tree. The traditions that have moved west, first off, many of the traditions that are out east have not really moved west and taken root and influenced the modern mindfulness movement that's behind everything from mindfulness-based stress reduction to calm and headspace. Those that have moved west, first...
So can I just pause on this for a second?
Yes.
So you're saying that our version of westernized meditation that we know is really just a fraction of the teachings.
That's my understanding, and I think that's like fairly supported by how few texts have even been translated into English, and how much longer and how much, in many ways, like convoluted and complex these traditions have borne out over the centuries out east, and only a subset of those people have even moved west, have even trained people that have moved west. So several of the teachers who I respect most, I think, look at what's out east and still see it as this like incredibly unexplored territory relative to what has come west, taken root, and led to these things that are already incredible. The modern mindfulness movement, particularly in the last decade, has done an incredible amount for an incredible number of people. And yet it's probably really a seed that's blossomed. And there's a much bigger like whole set of other seeds that could blossom too.
Wow. Okay. So back to your original thought. So you have the dry movements and then you have the wet movements. And where would you place yourself on that spectrum?
So in this, this wet versus dry, I actually don't even know the roots of this. I feel like I first found this on Reddit. So this like may be like the, some pocket of the, it would be funny to me if like it turns out this is actually how they describe it among like
very random words to describe meditation.
Oh, the this wet versus dry framing is one that I see come up periodically, and wet refers specifically to the use of things like altered states to then prepare yourself to engage in like behavior changing, personality changing, insight driven meditation. So in that context, the jhanas are exclusively, almost by definition, in the wet camp. It's about moving into altered states that then like change your perspective.
I think it's also very compelling because, at least in my experience, and I had my own background was I had meditated 6 years before having any type of psychedelic experience, and that was my true first altered state. And like all that made me do was want to go deeper. It was a very compelling motivator to further explore and eventually stabilize some of the experiences that I had. And I think that's an incredible consideration for people thinking about getting into this stuff.
Yeah. I really appreciate some of the elegance and wisdom behind some non-dual traditions, some noting traditions that have nothing and want nothing to do with the jhanas. And I just look at like the world today and I'm like, holy cow, this is the most important, neglected, and tractable thing I could possibly be working on. The idea of showing thousands, hopefully millions of folks, it turns out that you can have an MDMA-like experience simply within yourself. Like it's just waiting for you to sort of like open up the trap door. And the quality and the subsequent like mental health benefits that come from knowing you're capable of doing that, like it's something you can't unsee. And I think it's profoundly valuable. In many ways, just the start. It's not in place of all these other great traditions. It just 10x's what all these other traditions have, because you can do it faster and easier and you're motivated to do so. It's a win across the board, I think.
I agree. I think it's very exciting. And I know a lot of people, sometimes they get criticism. They're like, you didn't just tell us how to do the thing, on these podcasts. Is obviously there's way more than we could explain on a short podcast episode to the actual practicalities of getting into the jhanas. But does it align to the process you described earlier, where we're more or less kind of loving with a growing capacity everything that comes into the awareness?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts here that I think would be hopefully satisfy the listeners who are like, let me punch pause right now and do this myself. So the way I like to describe the jhanas to someone who's never had any experience with them is it's a positive feedback loop between attention and emotion. This is actually something I guarantee you are already familiar with. If you have ever experienced anxiety for more than just a couple of minutes, you know that like minute 10 of anxiety is much worse than minute 1. It's compounded. There's maybe a knot in your throat, your palms are sweaty, there's some sort of physiological change. An extreme version of that kind of anxiety is a full-on panic attack. Well, it turns out that this positive feedback loop, where attention begets emotion, which begets closer attention, which begets more emotion, is something that we can take in a positive direction. My favorite way of doing this is with loving kindness. And there's a couple of other elegant things about loving kindness that I think are great for this, including that inherent in like the felt experience of loving kindness is this, for those who are just on audio, I'm kind of like holding a fist and then opening it up. Like this letting go move is core to exploring the entire spectrum of jhanas, and I think arguably the entire spiritual path. And so what's great about using loving kindness as an object is that it's kind of already baked in there. There's like when you really are like giving away your loving kindness to something, there's that letting go in there. So I like to suggest that people use loving kindness as their core meditation object, and then really the only other piece to it, you're looking to like extend the ease and like effortlessness in which you're holding your meditation object. And then the only additional piece to it is any distraction that comes up, anything else that comes into your awareness, you just welcome it in. You're like, oh, thank you, my friend, for pointing out that I'm hungry right now. Come meditate with me. Like, oh, that like crazy thing that's bothering me about work. What a special learning opportunity. Like I'm so glad that you highlighted that. Like when somebody said something, it drove me up the wall. And like I want to welcome that part of me into this experience too. We're meditating now. Come with me. And instead of attempting to push away distractions. And so you can also kind of see now, A, how counterintuitive that is. Because most of the time when you're meditating, you're like, damn it, like get out of my head. Like I'm trying to focus. And then
Yeah.
two, how open and aware and robust and like at ease this experience will become more and more and more until finally you'll have like a nonlinear takeoff point and you're like, wow, I'm in an obviously altered state.
You know, it's very interesting because I can't help but kind of laugh at the mirroring of what you just described is to the broader consciousness path. You know, it's almost like a little microcosm of how to gradually increase these teachings and concepts like love is our core essence, and returning to that in a greater amount of time as we move through the world, and surrendering to what is, stopping the fighting. I mean, the method is kind of the method that eventually persists off of the cushion if you really want to go the distance.
It does seem I because I'm such a Jhana fan, I actively spend time like reading some books, and I'm about to go on a retreat that's entirely in like a non-Jhana tradition to see like what am I missing? Like why is this not just like spreading like wildfire yet? And one of the things that is reassuring is that so many of the later experiences in many of these just different traditions do seem to share a whole lot of similarities, and at their kernel they sort of approach some like core mental moves in the same way. I like to talk about it as like mental surrender or this like letting go. It's like that life skill we all know, we all have. It's like when we when we're sorry to a partner and we mean it, or when we like walk through the redwoods and open ourselves up to like being bowled over by awe and wonder, or the mental like almost emotional move you make that allows you to change your mind on something important before you actually change your mind on something important. Like this is a life skill that like we all have. It's necessary to work with others and like and actually to learn, and yet we don't have a language for it. And because we don't have a language for it, we don't talk about it. We don't practice it in the same way. But this is at the core of noting. This is at the core of jhanas. This is the core of like various yoga practices, and it's neat to see them all come together.
I love it, man. So let's fast forward a bit. You feel like you've discovered this secret treasure. You want to bring it to the world. Jhourney originally got on my radar when you were focused around integrating some technology into replicating this experience. And, where you are today, it actually, at least in this current moment, you guys have seemed like you've been doing some retreats. Can you talk to me a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, totally. So we are a tech company that's attempting to identify the neural correlates and the biocorrelates of these altered states, these jhanas, and then use them to build tools that help others get there faster and more confidently. So you can imagine that the dream is you put on a headset. If you're familiar with actually the Muse or some other related neurofeedback things, it would be very similar to this. But it's targeted towards these very specific states so that once you enter them, you can't unsee them. And most people talk about them being life-changing. So what that looks like is you put on a headset, you open your app, you start following ideally the best aggregation, like culmination of various jhana teaching traditions. And then the music you're listening to and the instructions that you're receiving change in real time based on your brainwaves as you meditate. This ideally dramatically cuts down on the time to enter into this state because so much of meditation is guesswork. It's inherently pre-verbal and invisible. It's not like teaching swimming or teaching almost any other thing that we do. There's a tremendous amount of guesswork that I have to figure out what's going on in your head as a teacher or vice versa. And so real-time, personalized, individualized feedback can make all the difference in eliminating that guesswork and making it faster to get there. It can also be a measure of progress. A lot of people give up before they succeed, even though they're headed in the right direction, because they have no notion of whether or not they're making progress. So that's what we're building. We set out to build that initially by putting together the largest data set in the world of jhana meditators, people moving into these states. We had first class research grade hardware. We're hosting retreats. We're going on retreats, collecting data. We now have what we think is the largest data set in the world. Harvard has an open study, and they may end up catching us.
Damn those Harvards.
Yeah. I'm cheering them on over there. It's a ridiculously neglected space. And so, and still not like getting mainstream funding or the like. And so, I would love to see that happen. They actually just published, Saket and crew just published a study a couple of weeks ago on fMRI case study. That was pretty exciting. But, we then, this past summer, sort of internally, were then set out to build ML algorithms on our existing data to see if we could accurately detect these states across folks. And so one of the big problems we faced was we want to be able to detect these states using like an ML algorithm within a given person. But the real challenge is, can we detect it across people? Can we train on all these people over here and then put the headset on somebody else's head and detect it accurately for the first time? That was the most fundamentally uncertain kind of neuroscientific piece of this puzzle. Often, a neuroscience effort dies at this cross-subject generalizability. We had sort of our 0 to 1 moment when we, for the first time, were able to see with about 75% accuracy us detecting these states on somebody that the model had never seen before. That happened this summer, and we were like, awesome. This really, we think, tells us that this problem is in fact tractable. We can build what we aspire to build. So now we have to adapt. We have to get this model better, and we also have to adapt it from experts to novices. That's hard because you need a lot of novices to do that. You need lots of trial and error. You need to be iterating on product and form factor. You need to be getting data into the model to eliminate false positives. And so faced with the need for a lot of novices learning jhanas, we were like, where are we going to do this? Where are we going to find these people? We're going to have to build it. We're going to have to build our own factory. So let's go start building jhana retreats. And so we gave ourselves 3 to 4 months to take a sprint at seeing whether or not we could create jhana retreats that would compete with some of the success rates of some of the best in the world. Fortunately, we knew many of these teachers and were able to sort of bring them in to sort of support us and give feedback as we were designing some of these. And we now are successfully, we've now had 3 retreats, all of which have seen about 65, 70% success in getting novices into jhanas without tech. And we'll soon be layering on tech and allow us to sort of create this pipeline where we're iterating on the tech with each new sort of cohort of folks that come through the retreat. And this will help us build what we aspire to build in the coming years.
That sounds very, very interesting. So in these retreats that you did, you were capturing data, like people were meditating connected to some type of device where you could monitor their experience?
That's right. Yeah. So we were using, in our case, 64 channel EEGs. It's like a $70,000 machine with a bunch of 64 specifically electrodes, and then a bunch of others that we would tape or put to your face. And there's some gel involved so we can get good electrical measurements. And then we also had things like heart rate variability monitors. We did pulse oximetry, galvanic skin response or electrodermal potentials. And then you hook everybody up to this gear and we have them meditate, and then they indicate with button clicks when they've entered into these special states.
Altered states.
Yeah.
What was the primary biofeedback indicators that indicated somebody was in an altered state?
So the model that we were using was an ML model that was actually fairly interpretable. It was like a support vector machine. I think we ended up using a random forest, and it's a little hard to talk about though because of sort of A, the nature of EEG, and B, the nature of machine learning. So I'll sort of like kind of 30 seconds on this. One, each of these sensors that we put on people's head is just, you can imagine like a single time series. It's just a graph over time that's going up or down. It's picking up changes in voltage. These changes in voltage end up like kind of picking up these oscillations and large scale neural activity that's happening in the brain. And we break these out into waves and we call them things like alpha, beta, theta, delta. You may have heard of these before. All that refers to is these different electrical oscillations happening at different speeds. But really like what's happening in the brain when you see an alpha wave is like a large cluster of neurons are now moving at this certain speed. And like, well, what exactly does that mean? Like what part of the brain is doing that? Like what's going on in the brain? This in many ways like EEG and most other neuroimaging at the end of the day is to some extent like just correlation work. You can do some interesting stuff with neuroanatomy and like lesions studies, but for the most part, you end up with these like waves that we are just okay. Well, when we see this wave, this seems to be happening, and we see this wave, like somebody's experiencing this kind of emotion. So that was the kind of data that we were collecting, and then we built an ML model that just we took a bunch of different like cuts of the data where it's like, okay, take this wave and like look at this frequency band. Okay, take this set of electrodes and like do an entropy analysis. And based on all these different cuts, which of these, when you kind of sift them through the ML algorithm, seem to be the ones that are corresponding to detecting jhanas? And we end up with like a list of a dozen features or something that like help us detect jhanas. But in terms of like, are they really useful for understanding what's going on in the brain? Like it's really bits and bytes.
I see.
Yeah.
What were the biggest takeaways after 3 retreats of taking novices through this process?
Mm.
And I guess as a part of that, has it shifted your thinking at all about how you bring this to the masses?
Yeah. That's a great question. Let's see if I can sort of package like lessons from teaching these states succinctly. I think my reflections have definitely changed as they've gone from like retreat to retreat, which is good. I think that probably means we're getting a bit more sophisticated. I think the number one thing is that these states are readily teachable and learnable. Like actually, even more so than I thought. We originally set out to collect data from experts because we assumed that we wouldn't be able to teach boatloads of novices right out of the gate. I think we're probably twice as effective as I thought we were going to be in the timeline that we had. So the first is that they're even more readily available than I thought. The second is so much of learning to enter into the jhanas is kind of like counterintuitive, especially for folks who come from other meditation backgrounds that emphasize a lot of effort. And so there's this sort of like prevailing notion that you have to sit long hours on the cushion and like notice every single little experience and not get distracted whatsoever. And it's actually those folks who come in that we have a harder time teaching than someone who comes in with almost like no experience whatsoever. Because we come in the door and we say, okay, look, there's 2 rules this week. You got to smile all the time, because the theory here being that like smile is a 2-way street. You are happy when you smile when you're happy, and if you smile, you're a bit more likely to be happy. There's like some interesting research to suggest that to some extent is the case. And the second thing is you got to have fun. Like if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. And that is just like so. I think for someone who like really comes in and is like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to crack the jhanas, and I'm going to come out the other side of the mountain victorious. It's like that's really hard to swallow. And so that I think is probably number 2. And then maybe number 3 is
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness: The Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below, and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show.
It has been so rewarding it was one thing to work hard to get the model to work better. And fight every day to see if we could improve our accuracy. It's a totally different thing to have someone like be in tears and be like, "This, I can't express to you." Like we're starting to actually do podcast interviews of folks that have come on our retreats, and a couple of people have talked about processing like suicides of their best friend. And this is where I think we get to the really exciting things about the jhanas is, having this like really fantastic peak experience is great and all. And this mentality of abundance that happens off the cushion is also super valuable. But what can be really excellent is you drop into a jhana. And because you dropped into a jhana, you're in this unusually resourced state, somewhere on that bliss peace spectrum. And then you just go turn and look directly in the eye, the most painful psychological thing in your being. And it could be like when you weren't there for the suicide of a best friend, or some other like deep thing, and you let that wash over you. And in this sort of specially resourced state, you just sit with it. You're not trying to change it. You just sit with it. And eventually that sort of kind of cluster of like challenge in your own psyche explodes into some sort of loving kindness or acceptance or peace. And then you get up and you're sort of permanently lighter. When that stimuli response pattern arises in the real world, it's like the acceptance of your most recent meditation, as opposed to whatever negativity used to be associated with that. That kind of like, I used to call it personal brainwashing before I knew what the jhanas were, because I was actually doing this myself. But it's actually eerily reminiscent of why MDMA 2X is psychotherapy. It's sort of the same process of moving into a special state and then looking at really tough things. And so I think see folks do that on our retreats, completely unprompted by us, has solidified my excitement for the cascading benefits of these things, not just the sort of first order effect of feels good.
That's amazing. It sounds like, I know we've talked about this before, very similar to memory reconsolidation as an underlying meta process that is really the only scientifically proven process to permanently transform behavior. And so I could see how that works. It looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, totally agree. I was avoiding the word memory reconsolidation, but since you brought it up, let me geek out for 1 minute.
Geek away.
My colleague Katie Devaney, neuroscientist who
she's been on this podcast.
Who's been on this podcast? That's right. I was just listening to her on this podcast the other day, and who was absolutely instrumental in helping us get off the ground. Pointing me to this paper that she threw up as like maybe illustrating the possible theory by which, like the mechanism under which or by which MDMA may in fact 2x the side effects of psychotherapy. And this paper was this seminal Nature paper that did a couple things that I thought were really interesting. They induced depression in mice, and then they used some clever tools to sort of allow them to manipulate the firing of specific brain circuits, and reintroduced the mice to the depression-inducing stimuli, which would normally just like cause more trauma or like activate all the trauma response. But if you hold a couple particular circuits at like steady firing rates, it actually cures depression one and done. And this is extremely difficult to replicate in humans. One, we're more complex. Two, there's a whole ethics about inducing depression in folks and like then sticking stuff in your brain and holding neural circuits firing constantly. So it's a big gap to jump from mice to humans. But nonetheless, I think offers this idea like, whoa. If the right conditions are present in your mind and you revisit a stimuli, it could be the case that the upper bound of therapy is actually one and done, solved. And in some ways, if you drop into a very special state like a jhana, or perhaps you're on MDMA, and then you very vividly revisit a memory and let it wash through your system while the rest of your system is in this either peaceful or open or not like lockdown PTSD kind of state, that could be the process of memory reconsolidation and leave you sort of permanently rewired on that particular topic.
That's amazing. So for your day-to-day experience, like how do you work this in? Like what does your typical meditation look like at this point?
Yeah. So for, I guess, about 5 years or so, I basically meditate first thing in the morning, and I start meditating. I sort of have my various, I have different ways that I get to jhana at this point. And so I just pick one and kind of have my like particular unique to Stephen mix of ways of getting things revved up. And then I'll usually let that ride for a little bit. It's sort of like building a fire. It requires a little bit of diligence up front, but then at some point it takes a life of its own, and then it just kind of sucks you into it. And then depending on how much time I've had, sometimes I'm in there really fast. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer. I will do exactly what we just talked about, which is I will go looking for the most painful psychological thing I can come up with in my experience, and I will just let that wash over me. And that may sound masochistic, and I assure you, it is the best habit I've ever built in my life. There's whether it's like the passing of a loved one and letting that kind of explode. Like, turns out that like the core of grief is love. Who knew? Or like getting over a traumatic breakup and like letting myself now sort of almost like rewrite all of the memories that we have together, such that like there was never any frustration or negativity that comes up with those memories. Now that when I think about her, it's almost entirely just all gratitude for the time we got to spend together. That was a challenge for me several years ago. Or it could be smaller, like something that somebody said yesterday that I didn't catch, kind of lodged in my subconscious, flew underneath my awareness. I didn't realize it was bothering me, and then let that go. In most ways, it ends up being a forgiveness practice, forgiving myself and forgiving others.
Yeah, that's really cool, man. I have a very similar practice where it's just writing down instances where I've been triggered, taken out of peace, seeing those as kind of gateways to the subconscious. And yeah, it's the most rewarding practice because you're just gradually improving your baseline to be, more open and loving and spacious and, more aligned to our true essence of what we really are.
Totally.
And so I completely agree with you. It's cool. It's cool how we all find ourselves in very similar places through unique journeying. So, I got to imagine there's probably some people that like don't love the idea of making this so easy. Like it's kind of like, oh, these people are cheating after they spent 10 years being beaten with a stick by a Zen monk or something like that. Like what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, that we get all kinds of questions about the work that we're doing, and I think depending on what background they're coming from, those questions take different shapes. For someone who's coming from 10 years of Zen, that's actually, Zen is one of the traditions that I'm least familiar with. And so I feel least qualified to speak to some of our differences. But we haven't gotten a ton of criticism for them. I don't think,
I wouldn't say Zen in particular. I mean, I guess just like one of those more like elongated traditions.
Yeah.
That are kind of like, whoa, you're like giving crack to a baby.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So sort of this like broader idea of like shortcut.
Yeah. You didn't earn it. Like you didn't earn it. Like type of thing.
Yeah. So for folks who are like in the don't earn it camp, I think there's almost like a better way of representing their core concern, because if you really look at the don't earn it camp, like, hold on, man, like, did you earn anything? Like, let's just like follow the sensations in your own experience, like back a little while, and let's see where they end up. And like, it's all Lee Brazington, actually, who does happen to be a Jhana teacher, but is also a big Dzogchen guy, has this frame like streams of dependently originating processes arising and passing away. I think like there's just like this deep interconnectedness at a certain, like, such that when you really look at the interconnectedness, the whole idea of like earn and deserve starts to get really fuzzy really quick. And so from that level, I think like the anti-shortcut argument kind of falls apart. There is an extent though of like, hang on, are you possibly missing something? Like if you're, and is there like, are you getting caught in the sirens, to use like a Greek mythology metaphor, where you're being like pulled off the board, pulled overboard into some sort of terrible trap? And it is totally the case that across Buddhism, there are anti-jhana, neutral jhana, and pro-jhana folks. And the neutral jhana are sort of like, yeah, that's like maybe something that happens, and like it's neither that good nor that bad. And the anti-jhanas are like, no, you can get distracted there and you're stuck there. This is somewhat related, I think, to spiritual bypassing, which is something that is like a phrase that's commonly thrown about. My take is that these states are like shockingly non-addictive. This in our conventional kind of culture, the idea of like extraordinary pleasure and addiction are almost like synonymous, ranging from Twitter to cocaine. But this is conflating two things that are clearly different. Or like laughing so hard you cry with loved ones, or a powerful entheogenic experience, or being bowled over by awe and wonder, either out in the redwoods or at your like childhood church, are all like incredible peak and pleasurable experiences, and they are all less addictive than scrolling Twitter. So these two things are clearly different, and the jhanas just happen to be in this camp that's like laughing so hard it hurts with your loved ones. Like you're not addicted to it. It's amazing, and you want to do it more, but you're just not addicted to it.
I mean, it's the same with psychedelics. It's like you could have like the I met God experience, and then you don't. It's kind of like cool, like
Tuesday.
yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, they're not addictive. It's just very fascinating.
Totally. So there's actually Michael Taft is maybe one of the teachers I know who speaks most directly and in some ways flippantly about the risks of spiritual bypassing, which is like a nuance of this. Like, is there some danger here? And his line, which I actually think makes a ton of sense, even if it is a little flip, is like, if I give you a fork, like you could stick it in your eye, or you could not. And that's more or less all he says about it, which is like a bit more flip than I think I mean to be for folks who are really concerned about spiritual bypassing. But I do want to point out that like these tools, this is a tool, and it can be used for like incredible things. And you could also use it to do things that like aren't that incredible. But why do that? And I think it's a little harder to feel comfortable with this until maybe you've experienced it for yourself and know just how non-addicting these states are. But I think it's very unlikely that you'll end up getting kind of caught in the quicksand, so to speak. And the other thing is like, because it requires this mental surrender, this like letting go to get into these states, like it's not like you can be clinging to the state in order to get in. Like these things are actually antithetical. Mm-hmm. The magic, the paradox of these states is you have to let go of that clinging in order to enter into it. And learning how to do that, it sounds paradoxical intellectually, but it turns out to be intuitively resolvable. And there's a lesson in of itself there.
I mean, the whole spiritual consciousness journey is a giant paradox in many ways, which I think enhances the richness. So, a question I have for you is like, there's 8 jhanas, correct?
Yes. Usually they're talked about in 8. Sometimes they're talked about as 4. And every now and then you hear colloquially about the 9th. For the most part, it's 8.
So the stuff that you guys are creating, is it getting people to the higher ones? Is it cascading the whole spectrum?
Yeah. Our approach right now is let's just get people into the first 1 or 2. Which is where most people start, not everybody, but where most people start. And just getting you on the map is a life significant moment. The sort of confidence knowing that you did this without drugs, that you are capable of doing this, is something you can't unsee. And so we think, well, let's just hit the catalyzing moment and then we'll worry about everything else after that. So we're all geared towards let's just get them into 1 or 2. And I think once we crack that puzzle, it will open up some interesting second questions, which is like, okay, now can we help people learn to navigate the full spectrum? But that's not on our map right now.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it's like the journey is one that continues to be like, when you get there, you're at the beginning again. Like with lots of experiences. One of my teachers was like, yeah, don't you know, like realizing who you are is the beginning. And I'm like, wow.
It feels like it's been the end for a long time. So
I know, dude. It's so funny.
Yeah.
What are you most excited about this and its implications for reaching the world?
I have this line that I like to throw out at frequently internally when we're talking as a team. It's like, imagine the day when Biden and Putin are tearing up for 30 minutes every morning as part of their morning routine. Like, as reported by most jhana meditators, like, wouldn't that be a different world? First order effects are often dwarfed by their second and later order counterparts. And I think this is absolutely true of the jhanas. Getting high is fun and all, but it's not about that. It's about the just like effortless pro-social nature that flows from when you know you can move yourself into completely imperturbable, like deep peace, or serenity or bliss. And so it's the second order effects of like kind of cascading through relationships that I think we're most excited about. On an impact side, on a sort of like kind of tech and business side, if we really dream about what like a 95th percentile outcome would look like if you had neurofeedback for life-changing states, you would have, I think for the first time, a like powerful alternative to pharma, like non-pharma intervention, and one that has pharma, something that pharma doesn't, which is data. So you can imagine integrating these kinds of things into virtual reality platforms if those continue to take off. Or arguably, this is another line that I like to say, any platform shift requires a killer application, or the for the platform shift is not sufficient to take something to scale. You can think of airplanes preceding airports, light bulbs preceding the electricity grid, the iPhone arguably preceding the mobile app market. The killer application of the iPhone taking mobile phones to a place that then allowed for the mobile app market. So too, if you had a killer application that could take a neural wearable to scale, that kind of platform shift may usher in a new like cascading slew of new things that that would arise if we all had the ability to sort of plug in and like use our brain data in really interesting and valuable ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, hopefully the old guard doesn't find a way to make it illegal. I wouldn't be totally surprised if there's some pushback.
No doubt. There will be, but this is sort of the same dream that like Neuralink and Kernel and many other like efforts are chasing after. And I think there are ways to do this that are responsible, and there are ways to do this that are unresponsible. And we aspire to take the responsible route.
I know a lot of people that are listening to this are going, okay, I'm sold. This sounds sweet. I want to get my jhana on. Where would a beginner go? What would you recommend?
Yeah. So we are just transitioning now from being like kind of purely tech focused to doing things like running the retreats, and we also experimented with cohort. And so jumping onto the Jhourney listserv, you can go to our website, jhourney.io, and signing up there, you'll be kept in the loop on any retreats that are happening, in which we aspire to increasingly layer on tech. We'll also be experimenting possibly with things like cohorts. We ran some workshops last summer to try to do things like, are people who are a bit more highly hypnotic able to enter the jhanas earlier, like these kinds of mini experiments. You can also follow me or my co-founder on Twitter. I actually have to look up his handle real quick.
We will link this in the show notes.
Cool. I'll do that
so
too.
We'll find. So everybody go to the show notes, and we'll have those.
Yeah, and then lastly, we're going to start hosting some of our own podcasts and being a bit more active on the blog. It's tough right now, I think, to traverse the jhana landscape because that word is overloaded, and then inside the cluster of teachers that are teaching lay accessible jhanas, they're often kind of tucked in their own way, and they're not always talking to each other. And so cutting across those resources is unfortunately difficult right now, but we'll be sharing more about what we think are some of the best of those resources and summarizing some of them in the months to come.
Amazing. You heard it here. Subscribe to the Jhourney.io listserv, and you'll get all of this as you guys start to put it out in the world. Well, Stephen, this has been an absolute pleasure, man. Love talking to you. Love hearing about and learning about this. I definitely walked away with some interesting ideas and desire to explore these more thoroughly in my own experience. So thanks for coming on, man, and sharing all your wisdom and experience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. It's been a lot of fun. And there's this, we're both in this together, so maybe it's preaching to the choir, but there's just this like palpable sense that this is a special time by which to combine some of the like technical and intellectual rigor of the sort of tech backgrounds and engineering approaches to the like powerful transformative well-being potential that are tucked away in wisdom and Western psychological positive psychology traditions. And your podcast cuts across that every episode. Oh, it's fun to be here.
Oh, thanks, man. I agree, dude. It is a freaking amazing time to be alive because, man, we just have access to so much of this information that so many humans didn't have before. And we also have this, these extraordinary tools that a lot of those kind of ancients and tucked away wisdom traditions didn't have.
It used to be that singing bowls were cutting edge technology. And now we can use ML algorithms and EEG systems towards the same end. The tools have changed.
Totally. That's, I love that. I love that idea of the singing bowls. Well, I appreciate it, man. And, perhaps we'll have to do another one of these in the future after you guys get many, many, many more people and cool tech to support them. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll be back. And Stephen, I just want to say thanks one last time.
Thank you, Scott. It's been fun.